The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of my downtown loft, casting long shadows across the Persian rug that Sarah had dismissed as probably fake just 3 weeks ago. I pressed my phone closer to my ear, listening to the familiar condescension dripping from my sister's voice like honey from a broken jar. "Mia, seriously, when are you going to get a real job?" Sarah's laugh tinkled through the speaker, that particular pitch she'd perfected in high school when she wanted to make me feel small. "I mean, I love that you're having fun with your little treasure hunts, but Mom's worried sick about you living paycheck to paycheck, buying junk at yard sales." I walked to my kitchen island, running my fingers along the edge of what Sarah would see as a simple wooden cutting board. What she didn't know was that this cutting board was actually an 18th century French breadboard, authenticated just last month, worth more than her annual salary at the marketing firm. The irony wasn't lost on me as I poured Ethiopian coffee from a silver pot that had once graced the table of a railroad baron. "I'm doing fine, Sarah," I said, keeping my voice level, practiced in this dance we'd been doing since I dropped out of law school 5 years ago. "Really?" "Fine?" Her voice pitched higher, the way it always did when she sensed she wasn't getting through to me. "Mia, you're 32 years old. You live in that tiny apartment, driving around in that beat-up Honda, spending your weekends at garage sales like some kind of treasure hunter?" I suggested, though I knew she meant something far less romantic. I was going to say bag lady in training. The words hit exactly where she intended them to. Look, I talked to David last night. He says there's still an opening at his firm. Entry level, sure, but it's a foot in the door. Real money, real future. You could stop all this pretending. Through my floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city awakening below. Business people in their press suits, clutching coffee cups, rushing toward lives of quiet desperation that they'd convinced themselves were success. 5 years ago, I might have been one of them. 5 years ago, I almost was. I'm not pretending anything, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hollow they sounded. Because in a way, I was pretending. Every day I pretended to be the failure my family saw, the disappointment who'd thrown away a promising legal career to chase fantasies. What they didn't see was the careful choreography of my real life, the delicate balance of anonymity that kept me safe and kept them in the dark. "Mom says you haven't been home for Sunday dinner in 2 months. Sarah's voice softened slightly, and I could picture her in her pristine kitchen, probably organizing her color-coordinated spice rack while she talked. Everything in Sarah's world had a place, a purpose, a price tag that made sense. "I miss you. We all do. But watching you throw your life away like this, it's killing her." I closed my eyes, letting the guilt wash over me like it always did. My mother, with her soft eyes and worried hands, who'd worked 2 jobs to put me through college, who'd cried with pride when I got into law school, who'd never said a word of reproach when I'd walked away from it all. She deserved better than a daughter who disappeared into a world she couldn't understand, who spoke in vague terms about finding herself while appearing to stumble through life without direction. "I'll come to dinner this Sunday," I said, because sometimes the small lies were kinder than the complicated truth. "Promise?" "Promise." After I hung up, I stood in the silence of my loft, surrounded by what Sarah would see as evidence of my failure and what I knew to be proof of something else entirely. The Ming vase in the corner, purchased for $15 at an estate sale in Brookline, now insured for $47,000. The oil painting above my desk, found in a pile of junk at a moving sale, bearing the signature of a minor but significant Hudson River School artist. The delicate Tiffany lamp casting rainbow patterns on my wall, its bronze base worn smooth by decades of hands that had no idea of its provenance. Each piece told a story, not just of artistic or historical significance, but of my own journey from the bright-eyed law student who thought success meant partnership tracks and billable hours. That girl had died slowly in the fluorescent-lit library of Harvard Law School, suffocated by the weight of expectations and the realization that she was built for something different, something that couldn't be quantified in yearly salaries or measured in corner office square footage. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had begun with a single purchase at a yard sale in Cambridge, where I'd been walking off the anxiety of another failed interview at a prestigious firm. An elderly woman was selling her late husband's bucks, and among them I had found a first edition Hemingway that she'd priced at $2. Something about the weight of it in my hands, the smell of aged paper and possibility, had awakened something in me that had been sleeping through 3 years of contracts and constitutional law. I'd sold that book for $800, and suddenly the world had shifted on its axis. Not because of the money, though that first taste of profit had been intoxicating, but because of what it represented. Hidden value, overlooked treasure, the thrill of seeing what others couldn't, of understanding the stories that objects carried within them.
Now, 5 years later, I moved through that world like a ghost, invisible to the very people who could have elevated me to celebrity status in their circles. I knew collectors who would kill for access to my finds, auction houses that would beg for my consignments, museums that would court my expertise. But anonymity was my armor, protecting not just my sources, but my family from a truth they weren't equipped to handle. The phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, my contact at the auction house. Client interested in the Chippendale. Can you authenticate provenance by Friday? I typed back a quick confirmation, then walked to my bedroom closet where the piece in question sat behind my winter coats like any other piece of secondhand furniture. A highboy that I'd bought for $35 from a widow in Marblehead, not knowing until I got it home that the construction techniques and wood aging pointed to 1760s Philadelphia, to one of the most celebrated furniture makers in American history. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. I lived surrounded by millions of dollars in authenticated antiques, yet I drove a 15-year-old Honda and shopped at thrift stores for my own clothes. The money I made, and it was substantial, far more than Sarah could imagine, went mostly back into the hunt. Better equipment, travel expenses, building relationships with estate sale companies and auction houses across 3 states. Some went into a savings account that grew steadily but invisibly, a safety net I hoped never to need. But the larger truth, the one that I carried like a secret weight in my chest, was that the money had never really been the point. It was the thrill of the hunt, the intellectual puzzle of authentication, the pure joy of rescuing beauty from obscurity. Every piece I'd saved from the Goodwill pile or the estate sale discard box felt like a small victory against the forces that would see history relegated to landfills and art dismissed as decoration. I thought about Sarah's words as I prepared for the day ahead. 3 estate sales in Newton, a house call in Beacon Hill to examine what the owner thought might be a fake Monet, but which, from the photo she had sent, bore all the hallmarks of being genuine. Each location held the possibility of discovery, the chance that someone's unwanted inheritance might be my next great find. But first I had to play the part. I changed into clothes carefully chosen to look casual, unassuming, broke. Jeans with authentic wear rather than designer distressing, a sweater from Target that I'd actually bought at Target, not from some vintage boutique in the South End. Worn sneakers that had earned their scuffs through honest miles rather than artificial aging. The costume of the harmless amateur, the wannabe, who posed no threat to the serious collectors. As I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, my phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. Ms. Chen, heard about your Revere Silver authentication. Very interested in discussing a potential acquisition. Can we meet? I deleted it without responding. There were always people trying to track me down, collectors who'd gotten wind of my reputation through the underground network of dealers and auction houses. But the moment I stepped into the light, became someone they could put a name and face to, everything would change. The access would dry up, the prices would skyrocket, and the pure joy of discovery would be corrupted by expectation and commercial pressure. Better to remain a ghost story whispered among the initiated. Better to let Sarah think I was failing while I quietly assembled one of the most significant private collections of American decorative arts on the East Coast. Better to endure the worried looks and well-meaning interventions than to explain why I'd chosen this strange, secret life over the conventional success they could understand. The elevator descended toward the parking garage, carrying me toward another day of carefully orchestrated deception. In a few hours, I'd be the slightly disparaging-looking woman pawing through someone's grandmother's things, offering $20 for what I hoped might be worth $20,000. I'd nod politely when other shoppers pointed out the junk I was buying, smile vaguely when dealers dismissed my purchases as tourist trinkets, and tonight I'd return to my loft full of treasures, surrounded by beauty that most people would walk past without a second glance, carrying the weight of a secret that grew heavier and more valuable with each passing day. The secret was that I wasn't failing at all. I was succeeding beyond anyone's wildest imagination in a language they'd never learned to speak. The Newton estate sale was everything I'd hoped for and everything I'd feared. The house itself was a testament to old New England money, Georgian colonial with original wide plank floors and crown molding that had witnessed 3 centuries of family dinners and holiday gatherings. But the family was gone now, scattered to retirement communities and distant cities, leaving behind a lifetime's accumulation of what they considered worthless relics.
I arrived early, as I always did, blending into the crowd of weekend treasure hunters and professional dealers who prowled these sales like predators sensing wounded prey. The difference was that they saw opportunity in the obvious pieces, the clearly marked silver, the paintings with recognizable signatures, the furniture that announced its pedigree. I saw possibility in the overlooked, the misidentified, the pieces that family members had relegated to the miscellaneous table with $5 price tags. That's where I found it, tucked between a collection of 1980s romance novels and a box of Christmas ornaments. A small wooden box caught my eye. The patina was wrong for modern manufacturing, and the dovetail joint spoke of hand construction from an era when such craftsmanship was a necessity, not luxury. I picked it up casually, running my fingers along the edges while maintaining the vacant expression of someone browsing without purpose. The woman running the cash box, clearly one of the surviving family members, noticed my interest. "That old thing," she said, with a tired smile. "I think it was my grandmother's sewing box or something. $20. $20 for what I was already certain was an 18th century document box, possibly made by one of the master cabinet makers who'd worked in Boston during the Revolutionary period. The wood grain, the construction technique, even the worn brass hinges all pointed to a provenance that could make this piece worth more than most people's cars. But I nodded as if $20 was a significant expenditure, counted out the bills slowly, and tucked the box under my arm like any other impulse purchase. As I walked back to my car, I caught sight of myself in the reflection of a shop window. The woman staring back at me looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, someone living paycheck to paycheck, making questionable purchases with money she probably didn't have. The costume was perfect, but underneath it, I felt the familiar weight of the deception settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. The drive back to downtown took me through neighborhoods where I'd grown up, past the small house where my mother still lived, still worried about her wayward daughter. I could have stopped, could have walked into that familiar kitchen and told her the truth, could have shown her bank statements that would have made her gasp, explained that her failure of a daughter was actually one of the most successful antique dealers on the East Coast. But the truth would have raised too many questions, would have shattered the careful fiction that kept my world intact. Instead, I drove past, carrying my latest treasure toward a loft that my family had never seen, filled with pieces they'd never understand. The isolation of my success was perhaps its heaviest burden. Who could I share these victories with? Who could understand the pure euphoria of recognizing a Goddard block front chest at a garage sale in Quincy priced at $50? Who could appreciate the intellectual satisfaction of tracing the provenance of a silver teapot from Paul Revere's workshop, hidden among estate jewelry in a box marked costume pieces? Back in my loft, I set the wooden box on my examination table and turned on the high-intensity lights I used for authentication work. Under magnification, the piece revealed itself like a flower opening to sunlight. The tool marks were consistent with 18th century hand planes. The brass hardware showed the kind of aging that couldn't be faked. metal worn smooth by decades of handling. Most telling of all was the interior construction. Secondary woods that pointed to Boston manufacture, joint techniques that dated the piece to within a narrow window of years. I photographed every detail, measuring and documenting with the precision of a forensic investigator. Then, I opened my laptop and began the research phase that separated the true professionals from the hopeful amateurs. Auction records, museum catalogs, furniture construction guides written by scholars who'd spent their careers studying the work of colonial craftsmen. The process could take hours or days, following threads of evidence across databases and archives that most people didn't even know existed. 3 hours later, I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. The box wasn't just colonial, it was a documented piece. One of 12 known surviving works by Nathaniel Gould, a master cabinet maker who worked in Salem from 1760 to 1790. A similar piece had sold at Sotheby's 2 years ago for $47,000. But this one was different. This one had never been cataloged, never appeared in auction records, never been studied by scholars. It was a ghost piece, surviving in family obscurity until this morning when I'd rescued it from between romance novels and Christmas ornaments.
I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt the familiar ache of solitude that accompanied all my greatest discoveries. There was no one to call, no one who would understand the significance of what I'd found. Marcus at the auction house would appreciate the commercial value, but he wouldn't understand the deeper meaning, the sense of connection to history, the responsibility of stewardship that came with owning something that had survived 2.5 centuries. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and I considered letting it go to voicemail, but guilt, that old familiar companion, compelled me to answer. "Mia, I'm so glad I caught you." Her voice carried the forced brightness that usually preceded bad news. "Listen, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning. I know I came on a little strong, but it's only because I care about you." "I know, Sarah, I appreciate." "Let me finish, okay?" I talked to David again, and he's willing to make a real offer. Entry-level associate position, $45,000 to start, full benefits, real career track. But he needs an answer by Monday. $45,000. I'd made more than that on a single piece just last month, a Chippendale high chest that I'd bought for $200 at an estate sale in Marblehead. But I couldn't explain that to Sarah without unraveling the entire carefully constructed fiction of my life. That's really generous of him, I said, because what else could I say? But I'm not sure. "Mia, please." The brightness in her voice cracked, revealing something rawer underneath. "Mom called me crying last night. Crying, Mia. She's convinced you're going to end up homeless, living in your car. And honestly, I'm starting to worry about the same thing." The words hit like a physical blow. I looked around my loft, at the Persian rugs and colonial furniture, at the built-in climate control system that maintained perfect conditions for preserving antique textiles, and the security system that protected millions of dollars in authenticated pieces. The idea that anyone could think I was on the verge of homelessness would have been laughable if it weren't so heartbreaking. "I'm not going to be homeless," I said quietly. "I'm doing better than you think." "Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're 32 years old with no real income, no benefits, no savings, no retirement plan. What happens when you can't afford that tiny apartment anymore? What happens when you get sick and can't afford medical care? What happens when you're 60 and realize you've wasted your entire life on a fantasy?" Each question landed with surgical precision, finding the soft spots in my armor. Because despite my success, despite my growing reputation in the antique world, despite the financial security that my family couldn't see, Sarah wasn't entirely wrong. What was I building toward? What was the end game of this secret life? "I need some time to think about David's offer," I said, hating the defeated tone that crept into my voice. "Of course. But Mia, don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often, and David won't hold the position forever."
After she hung up, I sat in the silence of my loft, surrounded by beauty and history, but feeling more isolated than ever. The Gould box sat on my examination table, its centuries-old craftsmanship a testament to the enduring value of things made with care and skill. But what was I doing with that legacy? Was I preserving it or just hoarding it? I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet where I kept my most valuable pieces. The Chippendale Highboy dominated the space, its mahogany surfaces glowing in the overhead light. Next to it hung a painting I'd found in a thrift shop in Somerville, a Hudson River school landscape that the previous owner had thought was a print. The insurance appraisal had valued it at $78,000. These weren't just possessions, they were responsibilities. Each piece deserved to be seen, studied, appreciated. Instead, they lived in my closet like expensive secrets, known only to me and the insurance company that would pay out if they were stolen or destroyed. Was I really any different than the families who'd relegated these treasures to yard sales and donation boxes? At least they'd let other people see them, even if they hadn't understood their true value. The weight of my contradictions pressed down on me as I made dinner in my kitchen, using a cutting board worth more than most people's monthly rent to slice vegetables for a meal that cost less than $10. I was wealthy beyond my family's dreams, but lived like I was barely scraping by. I was successful in a field that fascinated me, but had no one to share that success with. I was preserving history, but hiding it away where no one could appreciate it.
My laptop chimed with an email from Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts whom I'd worked with before on authentication projects. "Mia," she wrote, "I hope this finds you well. We're planning an exhibition on colonial craftsmen for next year, and I keep thinking about that incredible Townsend Goddard piece you authenticated for us last spring. I know you prefer to work behind the scenes, but have you ever considered a more public role? Your expertise is remarkable, and the field could benefit from your voice." The email sat open on my screen as I ate my simple dinner, its implications rolling through my mind like distant thunder. A more public role would mean stepping out of the shadows, abandoning the anonymity that had made my success possible. But it would also mean sharing my knowledge, contributing to the broader understanding of American decorative arts, maybe even inspiring a new generation of collectors and scholars. I thought about the young woman I'd been 5 years ago, sitting in that law school library, suffocating under the weight of expectations that had never really been mine. That woman had been terrified of disappointing people, of choosing the wrong path, of failing to live up to the potential that everyone else saw in her. In some ways, I was still that woman, still hiding, still afraid of the judgment that might come with visibility. But I was also something else now. I was an expert in my field, a scholar whose authentication work was sought after by major auction houses and museums. I was a businesswoman who'd built something remarkable from nothing more than curiosity and intuition. I was a guardian of history, someone who'd saved countless pieces from destruction or neglect. The question was whether I was brave enough to let the world see who I'd become, even if it meant disappointing the people who thought they knew what was best for me, even if it meant explaining to my family why I'd let them worry unnecessarily for years, even if it meant risking the comfortable fiction that had protected me from their expectations and their fears. I closed the laptop without responding to Dr. Morrison's email, but I couldn't close my mind to the possibilities it represented. Outside my windows, the city lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth, each one representing someone else's life, someone else's choices, someone else's struggle to become who they were meant to be. The Gould box sat on my examination table, waiting for its next chapter. I'd found it, rescued it, authenticated it, but what happened next would determine whether I was truly its guardian or just another stop on its journey through time. The same question applied to my own life, my own future, my own carefully hidden potential. Tomorrow, I'd have to decide whether to remain a ghost or finally step into the light. The breaking point came on a Tuesday that started like any other, but ended with the careful architecture of my double life collapsing around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. It began with a phone call from my mother, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Mia, honey, I need you to come home, right now." The words tumbled out of her in a rush that made my stomach clench with dread. "Your father. He had another episode.
The doctor says his heart is getting worse and the medication isn't working like it used to. I was in the middle of cataloging a recent acquisition, a set of coin silver spoons by Boston silversmith Joseph Richardson that I'd found buried in a box of miscellaneous kitchen items at a house sale in Brookline. The magnifying glass slipped from my numb fingers as my mother's words registered. My father, the quiet man who taught me to see beauty in forgotten things, who'd spent Saturday mornings with me at flea markets long before I knew they could be anything more than entertainment, was sick. Had been sick, apparently, for weeks while I'd been playing ghost in the shadows of the antique world. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The episode started about a month ago. Small ones at first, just some chest pain and shortness of breath. We didn't want to worry you kids until we knew more. Mom's voice cracked on the last words. But this morning was bad, Mia. Really bad. Sarah's already on her way from the office. Of course Sarah was. Sarah, who lived 15 minutes away in her perfect suburban house with her perfect husband and her perfect life that made sense to everyone. Sarah, who had Sunday dinner with our parents every week while I made excuses and hid in my loft, surrounded by treasures that suddenly felt meaningless. "I'll be right there," I said, already reaching for my keys. The drive to the hospital felt like traveling through molasses. Every red light an eternity. Every mile marker a reminder of how far I'd let myself drift from the people who actually mattered. I found myself in the cardiac unit of Massachusetts General, following signs that led to a waiting room where my family had gathered like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to vinyl chairs and hospital coffee while the machinery of modern medicine worked to save the man who'd held us all together.
Sarah looked up as I entered, her eyes red-rimmed but sharp, with an emotion I couldn't quite read. Relief? Anger? Both? She stood and hugged me, and I caught the scent of her expensive perfume mixed with the antiseptic smell of the hospital. "He's stable," she said without preamble. "For now. They've got him on some kind of drip that's regulating his heart rhythm, but the doctor wants to talk to all of us about options." The word hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Options, in hospital speak, usually meant difficult choices about quality of life, about how much intervention was worth pursuing, about preparing for possibilities that no family wanted to contemplate. Mom looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the oversized hospital chair and the weight of worry that seemed to have aged her years in the space of weeks. She reached for my hand as I sat beside her, and I was struck by how fragile her fingers felt, how the rings she'd worn for 40 years now slipped loose on her shrinking hands. "The doctor says he needs surgery," she said quietly. "A bypass. Maybe two, depending on what they find when they open him up. But," she paused, looking from me to Sarah and back again, "the insurance will cover most of it, but not all, and there will be recovery time, physical therapy, medications. Things are going to be tight for a while." I felt something crack inside my chest, a fissure that had been forming for 5 years, finally splitting wide open. Here was my family, facing financial strain to save the life of the man who'd given me everything, while I sat on liquid assets worth more than their house. Here was my mother worried about copays and deductibles, while I had a checking account that could cover the best cardiac surgeons in the country without making a dent in my monthly income. "How tight?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Sarah answered for Mom, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been having these conversations for weeks, while I'd been oblivious. "Tight enough that Mom and Dad are talking about taking out a second mortgage. Tight enough that I've offered to help, but with the kids' college funds and our own mortgage," she spread her hands helplessly. The silence that followed was filled with the ambient sounds of the hospital, distant conversations, the ping of elevators, the soft squeak of rubber soles on polished floors. I sat there calculating numbers in my head, thinking about the Chippendale highboy in my closet that could pay for Dad's surgery 10 times over, about the Persian rug in my living room that was worth more than their annual household income, about the bank account that grew larger every month while my family struggled with medical bills. "I can help,"
I said, the words falling out of me before I could stop them. Both women looked at me with expressions that ranged from surprise to skepticism. Sarah recovered first, her face settling into the patient look she used when she thought I was being naive. Mia, that's sweet, but we're talking about serious money here. Tens of thousands, maybe more depending on complications. I know you want to help, but with your situation, she trailed off diplomatically, but the implication was clear. She thought I was offering to chip in a few $100s from some imaginary savings account, a gesture that would be touching, but ultimately meaningless. How much? I pressed. What's the total we're looking at? Mom pulled out a folder of papers that looked like it had been handled by worried fingers for weeks. Insurance estimates, hospital billing sheets, surgeon consultation fees. The numbers swim before my eyes as she laid them out, but the bottom line was clear. $87,000, not including post-operative care, medications, or the income Dad would lose during recovery. $87,000. I'd made more than that on a single piece just 2 months ago, a Philadelphia tea table that I bought for $45 at a church rummage sale and sold to a private collector for $93,000. The irony was so sharp, it cut. I can cover it, I said, more firmly this time. The look Sarah gave me was a mixture of pity and frustration. Mia, I know you want to help, but this isn't the time for fantasy. We need real solutions, not wishful thinking. Something inside me snapped. 5 years of careful deception, 5 years of letting my family think I was failing when I succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, 5 years of watching them worry about me when I should have been helping them. It all crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. I'm not fantasizing, I said, pulling out my phone. I'm telling you, I can cover the entire cost today, right now. Before Sarah could protest again, I opened my banking app and turned the screen toward them. The numbers glowed like accusations in the sterile hospital light. 7 figures in my primary checking account, 8 figures in my investment portfolio, more money than either of them had imagined I could possess, more money than they'd see in a lifetime of steady paychecks and careful budgeting. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom stared at the screen like it was written in a foreign language she couldn't quite translate. Sarah's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been anger. What the hell is this? Sarah's voice was barely controlled, each word clipped with precision. Where did this money come from? What aren't you telling us?
And there it was, the question I'd been dreading and avoiding for 5 years. The moment when my carefully constructed fiction would either hold or crumble completely. I looked at my mother, at her worried face and her worried hands, and realized that the truth was going to hurt her more than any amount of money could heal. I've been working, I said, inadequately. Working? Sarah's voice rose sharply, drawing glances from other families scattered around the waiting room. Working at what? You said you were buying things at yard sales, selling them online for pocket change. You said you were barely getting by. The accusation in her voice was unmistakable, and it cut deeper than I'd expected. Because she was right, I had lied to them. Not directly, maybe, but through omission, through misdirection, through letting them believe something that served my purposes more than their peace of mind. It's complicated, I began, but Sarah was past the point of accepting easy explanations. Complicated? Mia, Mom has been losing sleep for months thinking you are going to end up on the street. I've been calling you twice a week trying to set up job interviews. We've all been worried sick about you, and you've been sitting on millions of dollars? How is that complicated? Her voice cracked on the last word, and I realized that what I'd taken for condescension all these years had actually been fear. She hadn't been looking down on me. She'd been terrified for me. They all had been. I buy and sell antiques, I said, the words feeling strange after years of deflection. I'm good at it, really good at it. I find pieces that other people don't recognize, authenticate them, and sell them to collectors and museums.
Antiques? Mom's voice was small, confused. You mean like old furniture? Among other things, yes. American decorative arts mostly. Colonial furniture, silver, paintings. I've authenticated pieces for the Museum of Fine Arts, for Sotheby's, for private collectors who specialize in early American craftsmanship. As I spoke, I watched their faces change. Mom looked like she was trying to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with the person I was describing. Sarah looked like she was doing complex calculations in her head, trying to figure out how the numbers could possibly add up. "But you said you were struggling," Sarah said slowly. "You said you couldn't afford things. You drive that beat-up Honda, you live in that tiny apartment. I live in a loft downtown that costs more per month than most people make in a year. The Honda's camouflage. If I showed up at estate sales in a luxury car, prices would triple before I got through the door. Everything about how I present myself is designed to help me do my job better." The words poured out of me like water through a broken dam, years of carefully guarded secrets spilling into the antiseptic air of the hospital waiting room. I told them about the Persian rug that Sarah had dismissed as fake, about the cutting board that was actually an 18th century artifact, about the systematic deception I'd constructed to protect my sources and maintain my competitive advantage. So when I said I was fine, I meant it. I've been more than fine. I've been successful beyond anything I ever imagined possible. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush us all. Mom stared at her hands, processing revelations that redefined everything she thought she knew about her younger daughter. Sarah stared at me like I was a stranger wearing her sister's face. "Why?" Mom's voice was barely audible. "Why didn't you tell us?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for months, the one I'd never found a satisfactory answer to. Why had I chosen isolation over honesty? Why had I let them worry when I could have eased their fears with a single conversation? "I was afraid," I said finally. "Afraid you wouldn't understand. Afraid you'd want me to change what I was doing. Afraid you'd think I was crazy for walking away from law school to chase antiques." And then, after a while, the lie became easier than the truth. "Afraid we wouldn't understand?" Sarah's voice was rising again, drawing more stares from across the waiting room. "Mia, you let Mom cry herself to sleep thinking you were going to end up on the street. We've all been believing you were throwing your life away. How is that better than risking our disapproval?" She was right, and we all knew it. The cruelty of my deception was becoming clear, not just to them, but to me. In protecting myself from their judgment, I'd subjected them to years of unnecessary worry. In maintaining my competitive advantage, I'd sacrificed the relationships that mattered most. "I'm sorry," I said, knowing the words were inadequate. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you years ago. I should have trusted you to understand."
Understand what? Mom looked up from her hands, her eyes bright with unshed tears. That you didn't think we were smart enough to keep a secret? That you didn't trust us enough to share your success? That you thought we'd rather worry about you than celebrate with you? Each question hit like a physical blow, laying bare the selfishness of my choices. I'd told myself I was protecting them, but really, I'd been protecting myself from their expectations, from their questions, from the responsibility that came with letting people into your real life. A doctor appeared at the edge of our family drama, clipboard in hand and the kind of expression that suggested he'd interrupted more than one difficult conversation in hospital waiting rooms. "Chen family, I have an update on your father's condition." We followed him to a small consultation room, where the fluorescent lights made everything look sickly and pale. Dad was stable, he explained, but the surgery needed to happen soon, within the week if possible. The longer they waited, the higher the risk of another, more serious episode. "About the financial arrangements," the doctor continued, "I understand there might be some insurance complications." "There won't be any complications," I said, cutting him off. "Whatever insurance doesn't cover, I'll handle directly. I want him to have the best surgeon you have, the best care available. Money is not a factor." The doctor nodded and made notes on his clipboard, but I could feel my family's eyes on me like physical weight. After he left, we sat in the small room with its motivational posters about heart-healthy living and its pamphlets about coping with cardiac events, trying to process the convergence of my father's health crisis and the implosion of my carefully maintained fiction. "I need some air," Sarah said, finally, standing abruptly and walking out of the room. I started to follow her, but Mom caught my arm. "Let her go," she said quietly. "She needs time to think. We all do." But thinking was the last thing I wanted to do. Thinking meant confronting the full scope of what I'd done, the relationships I'd damaged, the trust I'd betrayed. Thinking meant acknowledging that my success in the antiques world had come at the cost of honesty with the people who mattered most. I found Sarah in the hospital parking garage, leaning against her sensible sedan and staring out at the Boston skyline. The afternoon sun slanted through the concrete structure, casting long shadows that made her look older than her 35 years. 5 years, she said, without looking at me. 5 years of phone calls where you sounded defeated, where you let me lecture you about getting your life together. 5 years of me lying awake at night worrying about my baby sister. I know. I'm sorry. Sorry? She turned to face me, and I saw that her eyes were bright with anger and hurt. "Mia, do you have any idea what it was like thinking you were failing? Thinking I had to save you from yourself? I felt responsible for you, guilty that I had succeeded when you were struggling." The words hit harder than any accusation of deception. I'd been so focused on protecting my secret that I'd never considered how my performance of failure might affect the people who loved me. I felt like I had failed you somehow. Like maybe I should have done more to help you in law school, should have been a better sister, should have found a way to guide you towards something stable. I've been carrying that guilt for years, Mia, years. I stood there in the parking garage, surrounded by the ordinary cars of people dealing with ordinary crises, and realized that my extraordinary deception had created ordinary pain. The kind of pain that came from feeling responsible for someone else's apparent failures. From loving someone who seemed determined to throw their potential away. "You didn't fail me," I said quietly. "If anything, I failed you. I failed all of you." "You didn't fail," Sarah said, her voice softening slightly, "but you disappeared. The sister I knew, the one who used to call me when she was excited about something, who used to share her dreams and fears, she vanished into this person who spoke in vague terms about finding herself, while clearly struggling." She was right. In becoming Mia, the antiques expert, I'd stopped being Mia, the sister, Mia, the daughter, Mia, the person who belonged to a family that loved her. I'd traded those identities for professional success and personal isolation, and the exchange had cost more than I'd realized. "I want to see it," Sarah said suddenly. "See what?"
Your life. Your real life. This loft you live in, these antiques you've collected. I want to understand what was so important that you'd let us think you were failing to protect it. The request caught me off guard. For 5 years, my loft had been a sanctuary, a place where I could be my true self without performance or pretense. The idea of letting my family into that space felt like the final dissolution of the boundaries I'd worked so hard to maintain. But maybe that's what needed to happen. Maybe it was time to tear down the walls I'd built between my public self and my private truth. "Okay," I said, "but you have to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you won't tell anyone else about this, about the money, about what I do, about any of it. Why success depends on anonymity, on being able to blend into the background at sales and auctions. If word gets out about who I really am, it could destroy everything I've built." Sarah studied my face for a long moment. and I could see her weighing her answer. "I promise," she said finally. "But in exchange, you have to promise me something too." "What?" "Promise me you'll never lie to us again. Not about money, not about your life, not about anything that matters. We're family, Mia. We're supposed to take care of each other, and we can't do that if we don't know what's real." I nodded, though the promise felt heavier than it should have, because honesty was more complicated than Sarah realized. The antique world was built on secrets, on information asymmetries that created opportunities for those who knew how to exploit them. But maybe it was time to find a way to balance professional discretion with personal honesty. "Deal," I said, and meant it. We drove back into the city in separate cars, Sarah following me through traffic that seemed lighter now that the weight of deception was lifting from my shoulders. I found myself looking at familiar streets with new eyes, seeing them not as the background to my secret life, but as the setting for whatever came next. The elevator ride to my loft felt longer than usual, weighted with anticipation and dread. I'd never shown my real life to anyone who mattered to me, never had to explain the choices I'd made or justify the world I'd built. As the doors opened onto my private sanctuary, I saw it through Sarah's eyes and realized how much explaining I had ahead of me. She stepped into the space slowly, like someone entering a museum after hours. Her eyes moved from the Persian rug to the Chippendale furniture to the oil paintings that covered the walls. I watched her face as understanding dawned, as the scope of what I'd accomplished became clear. "Jesus, Mia, this is incredible." And then she started to cry, not the angry tears of betrayal, but something deeper and more complex. Relief, maybe, that her sister wasn't the failure she had appeared to be. Pride in accomplishments she'd never known existed. Grief for the years of unnecessary worry, for the relationship that could have been if I'd trusted her with the truth. I stood in the middle of my beautiful loft, surrounded by treasures that suddenly felt less important than the woman crying in my doorway, and realized that the most valuable thing I'd collected might be the courage to finally let my family know who I'd become. The weeks that followed felt like living in a house where all the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. Everything looked familiar, but nothing was quite where you expected it to be. Dad's surgery had gone better than anyone had dared hope. The surgeon found 2 blockages instead of the 3 they had feared, and his recovery was progressing ahead of schedule. But the revelation of my hidden life created ripples that spread far beyond the immediate crisis. Sarah had kept her word about discretion, but she'd also insisted on being more involved in my world than I'd ever allowed anyone to be. She started accompanying me to estate sales, not as a participant, but as an observer, trying to understand the mechanics of what I did. At first, her presence felt like an invasion, a disruption of the careful choreography I'd perfected over 5 years. But gradually, I began to see my work through her eyes, and what I saw surprised me. "You're not just buying and selling things," she said one morning as we drove back from a house sale in Lexington. I'd found nothing significant that day. Sometimes the hunt yielded treasure, sometimes it yielded only the satisfaction of the search itself. "You're like a detective. The way you examine things, the way you research them, the way you piece together their histories, it's actually intellectual." The word stung more than she'd intended. "You thought what I was doing wasn't intellectual?" "I thought what you were doing was random," she admitted. "I thought you were just hoping to get lucky, buying stuff you liked and hoping someone else would pay more for it. I didn't realize there was so much knowledge involved, so much research and authentication and expertise." We were stopped at a red light,
and I watched pedestrians cross the street with their purposeful strides, heading toward jobs and lives that made sense to everyone around them. For the first time in years, I wondered what that felt like, to have work that you could explain at cocktail parties, accomplishments that fit into conventional categories of success. "I've been thinking about Dr. Morrison's email," I said, surprising myself with the admission. "The one about the museum exhibition." Sarah glanced at me, her expression carefully neutral. "What about it?" "She wants me to consider a more public role, contributing to their exhibition on colonial craftsmen, maybe writing some catalog essays, participating in scholarly panels." The words felt strange in my mouth, like a foreign language I was just learning to speak. "That sounds incredible. Why haven't you responded?" "Because once I step into that world officially, everything changes. The anonymity that lets me find undervalued pieces, the ability to blend into estate sales without being recognized, it all disappears. I become Mia Chen, the antique expert, instead of just another weekend treasure hunter." The light changed and we drove in silence for a few blocks before Sarah spoke again. "Maybe it's time for things to change." That afternoon, I sat in my loft staring at Dr. Morrison's email, which had grown no less intimidating with time. The cursor blinked in the empty reply field like a heartbeat, waiting for me to decide who I wanted to be next. Around me, my collection seemed to pulse with its own quiet energy. Centuries of craftsmanship and artistry that I'd rescued from obscurity. Beautiful things that deserved to be seen and understood and celebrated. I thought about the Gould document box that still sat on my examination table, fully authenticated now and ready for whatever came next. It had survived 2.5 centuries in family hands, passed down through generations who'd valued it enough to keep it, but hadn't understood its true significance. Now it was mine, but what was I going to do with that stewardship? Keep it hidden in my loft like all the others, or find a way to share its story with the world? My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. Marcus from the auction house, his voice carrying the particular enthusiasm that meant he had news he thought I'd want to hear. "Mia, I just got off the phone with a collector in California. He's looking for documented colonial furniture, particularly Boston area craftsmen. I mentioned the Chippendale piece you consigned with us last month, and he's very interested. But here's the thing. He wants to meet the person who found it and authenticated it. He's offering a significant premium if he can work directly with the source." My stomach clenched. This was exactly what I'd been avoiding for 5 years. The moment when my reputation outgrew my anonymity, when clients started wanting to put a face to the expertise they were purchasing. "How significant a premium?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why the number mattered. 30% above our highest estimate. We're talking about an additional $40,000, Mia. But he's adamant about the meeting, says he's tired of working with intermediaries when he could be learning from the person who's actually doing the discovery work. $40,000 for a single conversation. The amount was significant even by my standards. But more important than the money was what it represented. Recognition of my expertise. Acknowledgement that what I'd built was valuable not just financially, but intellectually. "I need some time to think about it," I said. "Of course, but don't take too long. This kind of opportunity doesn't come around often, and there are other experts who would kill for this kind of direct client relationship." After Marcus hung up, I found myself walking through my loft like a tourist in my own life, seeing each piece not just as a beautiful object, but as evidence of the expertise I'd developed. The Persian rug that had fooled Sarah wasn't just valuable, it was a testament to my ability to recognize quality that others had missed.
The Hudson River School painting wasn't just an investment, it was proof that I could distinguish authentic period work from later reproductions and prints.
Each piece told a story of research and authentication, of scholarship and intuition working together to unlock secrets that had been hiding in plain sight. Collectively, they represented a body of knowledge that museums and collectors valued, expertise that scholars respected, discoveries that contributed to the broader understanding of American decorative arts. So why was I hiding it? The question followed me as I made dinner, as I responded to emails from other dealers and auction houses, as I researched a set of silver teaspoons I'd bought at a church rummage sale the previous weekend. Everything I did demonstrated the same pattern: careful analysis, meticulous documentation, scholarly research that would make any academic proud. But I was doing it all in isolation, contributing nothing to the larger conversation about the objects I studied. That evening, Sarah called to check on me, a habit she'd developed since learning about my real life. The conversations were different now, less worried, more curious, as if she was getting to know a sister she'd never met before. "How was your day?" she asked, and for once, I could answer honestly. Complicated. I got an offer to meet directly with a collector, someone who wants to work with me personally instead of going through auction houses. It's a lot of money, but it would mean stepping out of the shadows. And that scares you? Terrifies me, I admitted. Once people know who I am, once my name gets associated with these discoveries, the whole dynamic changes. Prices go up at sales when dealers recognize me. Sources dry up because sellers realize they might be sitting on valuable pieces. The competitive advantage I've built disappears. But you'd gain other things, Sarah said thoughtfully. Recognition for your expertise, the ability to teach other people, to share what you've learned. Maybe even the chance to ensure that important pieces end up in museums instead of private collections. Her words echoed something Dr. Morrison had written in her follow-up emails, which had become increasingly frequent as the deadline for the exhibition approached. The museum wasn't just interested in my authentication services. They wanted to feature some of my discoveries, to tell the stories of how these pieces had survived and been rediscovered, to celebrate the scholarship that brought forgotten treasures back into public consciousness. "I keep thinking about Dad," I said suddenly, about how proud he was when I got into law school, how he talked about his daughter the lawyer to anyone who would listen. What if he knew what I was actually doing? What if he knew I was an expert in something that mattered, that museums sought out my opinion, that collectors trusted my authentication? He'd be proud, Sarah said without hesitation. He'd be incredibly proud. But Mia, he's proud of you now. We all are. The question is whether you're proud of yourself. The conversation stayed with me long after we hung up. Was I proud of myself? I'd built something remarkable from nothing, developed expertise that was respected in academic and commercial circles, assembled a collection that any museum would envy. But I'd done it all in secret, sharing the victories with no one, celebrating the discoveries alone. What was the point of achievement if it couldn't be acknowledged? The next morning brought another email from Dr. Morrison, this one with a subject line that made my heart race. Final invitation, exhibition catalog deadline approaching. I opened it with trembling fingers, knowing that whatever I decided would fundamentally change the trajectory of my life. Dear Mia, I hope this message finds you well and still considering our conversation about the Colonial Craftsman exhibition. I wanted to reach out one final time because I believe your contributions could be transformative, not just for this exhibition, but for the field as a whole. Your authentication work on the Townsend Goddard piece was groundbreaking, and your ability to identify previously unknown works by documented craftsmen is exactly the kind of scholarship that advances our understanding of American decorative arts. She went on to detail the scope of what she was proposing, not just catalog essays, but a featured section on rediscovered treasures, highlighting pieces that had been identified and authenticated by contemporary scholars. My work would be prominently credited, my expertise acknowledged in the kind of scholarly publication that launched academic careers.
I understand your hesitation about publicity, she continued, but I want you to consider the educational impact of sharing your knowledge. Young scholars need examples of how careful research and trained observation can unlock historical secrets. Collectors need guidance about what to look for and how to authenticate their discoveries. The field needs voices like yours, passionate, knowledgeable, committed to preserving and understanding our material heritage. The deadline for final submissions was Friday. 3 days to decide whether I was ready to step into the light.
I spent those 3 days in a kind of limbo, going through the motions of my regular routine while my mind wrestled with possibilities and consequences. I visited 2 estate sales, finding nothing significant, but observing how differently I felt about the hunt itself. Every interaction with dealers and other collectors felt weighted with potential recognition. Every casual conversation about my hobby felt like a small betrayal of the expertise I'd developed. On Wednesday, I met with Dad for the first time since his surgery. He was home now, moving carefully, but with more energy than he'd had in months. Mom had prepared his favorite lunch, and we sat in the kitchen where I'd eaten thousands of meals, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of my childhood. "You look different," Dad said after we'd talked about his recovery, about the physical therapy that was helping him rebuild his strength. Not different physically, different, I don't know, lighter somehow. I realized he was right. The weight of maintaining 2 separate identities had been lifted, replaced by the different, but somehow more manageable challenge of deciding who I wanted to be going forward. "I've been thinking about changing some things in my life," I said carefully. "Being more open about what I do, maybe taking on some public projects." Dad's eyes brightened with interest. "What kind of projects?" And suddenly I found myself telling him about Dr. Morrison's invitation, about the museum exhibition, about the possibility of sharing my expertise with a broader audience. As I spoke, I watched his face transform with understanding and pride. The same expression he'd worn when I'd been accepted to law school, but somehow warmer, more genuine. "You're talking about becoming a teacher," he said when I'd finished. "Not in a classroom, necessarily, but teaching people to see what you see, to understand what you understand. That's a gift, Mia. That's a calling." The words settled over me like a warm blanket. A calling. Not just a job or a career, but something deeper. A responsibility to share knowledge that could otherwise die with me, to ensure that the expertise I'd developed served something larger than my own success. That evening, I sat down at my computer and began to compose my response to Dr. Morrison. The words came slowly at first, then faster as I found my voice. Not the voice of Mia, the hidden expert, but of Mia, the scholar, the educator, the person ready to contribute to conversations that mattered. "Dear Dr. Morrison," I wrote, "I would be honored to participate in your exhibition on colonial craftsmen. I believe strongly in the educational mission of museums, and I'm ready to share my research and discoveries with a broader audience. I have several pieces that would be perfect for the Rediscovered Treasures section, each with a documented provenance that illustrates the importance of careful authentication in understanding our material heritage." As I wrote, I felt something fundamental shifting inside me. The fear was still there, but it was balanced now by something stronger. Excitement about the possibilities that lay ahead, anticipation of conversations with other scholars who shared my passion, the satisfaction of contributing to knowledge that would outlast my own lifetime. I attached images and documentation for 3 of my most significant finds: the gold document box, a silver teapot by Paul Revere that I had authenticated just 6 months ago, and a painted chest by a previously unknown Connecticut craftsman whose work I'd been tracking across multiple collections. Each piece represented hundreds of hours of research, meticulous documentation that would add to the scholarly understanding of American decorative arts. Before I could second-guess myself, I hit send.
The response came back within hours, faster than any email I'd ever received from an academic institution. Dr. Morrison's excitement was palpable, even through the formal language of professional correspondence. She wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the exhibition in detail, to see my collection, to understand the methodology behind my discoveries. Your willingness to participate changes the entire scope of what we can accomplish, she wrote. I've been following your authentication work for 2 years now, and I can say without exaggeration that your contributions represent some of the most important discoveries in American decorative arts in the past decade. The past decade. I read the phrase 3 times, letting it sink in. In my mind, I'd been playing at scholarship, pursuing a passion that happened to be profitable. But Dr. Morrison saw it differently. She saw genuine contributions to academic knowledge, discoveries that advanced understanding in a field that mattered to historians and art scholars around the world. My phone rang as I was rereading her email for the 4th time. Sarah's number appeared on the screen, and I answered with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. I did it, I said, before she could speak. I said yes to the museum exhibition. I'm going to be a public scholar, an acknowledged expert. I'm going to let people see what I've built. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard Sarah's voice, thick with emotion. I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of who you've become, and I'm proud that you're finally ready to let the world see it too.
As we talked about the logistics of going public, about the changes this would bring to my work and my life, I found myself looking around my loft with new eyes. These weren't just my private treasures anymore. They were pieces with stories that deserved to be told, artifacts that could teach people about craftsmanship and history and the importance of preserving material culture. The Chippendale highboy in my closet wouldn't be hidden away much longer. The Persian rug that had fooled my sister would soon have a museum placard explaining its origins and significance. The oil painting I'd rescued from a thrift shop would hang in an exhibition where thousands of people could see it and understand its place in American art history. I was finally ready to share the wealth I'd accumulated, not just the financial wealth, though that would come, but the intellectual wealth. The knowledge and expertise and passion that had driven me for 5 years. I was ready to be recognized not as someone who'd failed to become a lawyer, but as someone who'd succeeded at becoming something else entirely. A scholar, a detective, a guardian of history who had found her calling in the most unexpected place. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. Six months after sending that first email to Dr. Morrison, I stood in the grand entrance hall of the Museum of Fine Arts watching visitors move through the Hidden Treasures Rediscovered American Craftsmanship exhibition with expressions of wonder and discovery. The transformation felt surreal. After 5 years of operating in shadows, I was watching strangers examine pieces I'd authenticated, reading the scholarship I'd contributed, learning from expertise I'd thought would remain forever private. The response has exceeded our wildest expectations, Dr. Morrison said, appearing at my side with the satisfied smile of a curator whose gamble had paid off spectacularly. We've had requests from 3 other museums to tour the exhibition, and the catalog is already in its 2nd printing. The section on authentication methodology that you wrote has become required reading and graduate decorative arts programs. I nodded, still adjusting to the strange reality of public recognition. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of changes that touched every aspect of my carefully constructed life. My anonymity at estate sales had indeed disappeared, but not in the catastrophic way I'd feared. Instead, I'd found myself becoming a different kind of expert, someone who educated sellers about the potential value of their possessions, who helped families understand what they owned before deciding to sell it. The financial impact had been complex.
While I could no longer find undervalued treasures quite as easily, my reputation as an authenticator had created new revenue streams. Museums consulted me on potential acquisitions. Collectors hired me to verify provenance. Auction houses competed for my consignment services, knowing that pieces authenticated by Mia Chen commanded premium prices. More surprising than the professional changes were the personal ones. Sarah had become not just a sister, but a collaborator, using her marketing expertise to help me build a professional website and manage the flood of authentication requests. She'd insisted on creating systems and structures that would allow me to scale my expertise while maintaining scholarly rigor. You can't personally authenticate every piece people want to send you, she'd said during one of our strategy sessions in my loft, now transformed into a proper home office with professional photography equipment and climate-controlled storage. You need to think bigger. What about workshops? What about training other people to recognize what you see? The suggestion had led to my most unexpected development: teaching. Not in a traditional classroom, but in intensive seminars for dealers, collectors, and museum professionals who wanted to develop their authentication skills. The first workshop I had offered had filled within hours of being announced. The second had a waiting list of over 100 people. Standing in the museum, watching a group of college students sketch details from one of my authenticated pieces, I thought about how completely my understanding of success had transformed. 6 months ago, success had meant financial gain achieved in isolation. Now it meant something entirely different: the satisfaction of watching knowledge spread, of seeing expertise multiplied rather than hoarded. "Mia?" A voice behind me interrupted my reflections. I turned to see a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, holding a worn notebook and looking nervous. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you Mia Chen, the one who found the Revere teapot?"
I smiled, recognizing the expression of someone who'd discovered a passion they didn't know how to pursue. "I am. Are you interested in decorative arts?" "Obsessed," she admitted with a self-conscious laugh. "I'm finishing my master's in art history, but I've been following your work since the exhibition opened. The way you trace provenance, the methodology you use for authentication, it's exactly what I want to learn how to do." Her enthusiasm reminded me of myself 5 years ago, standing in that Cambridge yard sale with a first edition Hemingway in my hands, sensing possibilities I couldn't yet articulate. "Have you considered applying for one of my workshops?" "I can't afford them," she said honestly. "Graduate student budget, you know? But I've been reading everything you've published, trying to learn on my own." The conversation stayed with me as I made my way through the exhibition, stopping to listen to visitors discuss pieces I'd discovered and authenticated. Their engagement was gratifying, but the young woman's situation nagged at me. How many potential scholars were out there, passionate about material culture but lacking access to the training that could transform enthusiasm into expertise? That evening, I sat in my loft, now featured in Architectural Digest as an example of scholarly collecting at its finest, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible a year ago. I picked up my phone and called Sarah. "I want to start a foundation," I said, without preamble. "Something that provides scholarships for people who want to learn authentication and preservation but can't afford the training." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could picture her in her home office, probably already taking notes. "Tell me more." "There are so many pieces of American material culture that are being lost because people don't know how to recognize them. Furniture gets thrown away, silver gets melted down, paintings get damaged because families don't understand their significance. But if we could train more people, not just wealthy collectors, but regular people to recognize and preserve these objects..." "You're talking about democratizing expertise," Sarah said, her voice growing excited, "making authentication knowledge accessible to people who could use it in their communities, their families, their local historical societies." "Exactly, and providing pathways for people like that graduate student I met today, people who have the passion but not the resources to develop their skills professionally."
The idea grew as we talked, evolving from a vague notion into a concrete plan. The Mia Chen Foundation for American Material Culture would offer scholarships for authentication workshops, grants for preservation projects, and educational resources for anyone interested in understanding and protecting historical objects. It would be funded by a percentage of my ongoing authentication work, ensuring that the commercial success of my expertise would support broader educational goals. "There's something poetic about it," Sarah observed as we wrapped up our planning session. "You spent 5 years hiding your knowledge, and now you're going to give it away." She was right, but it didn't feel like giving anything away. It felt like multiplication, like planting seeds that would grow into expertise I could never achieve alone. Every person I trained would see things I might miss, ask questions I wouldn't think to ask, make connections I couldn't make. The foundation wasn't just about sharing knowledge, it was about expanding it exponentially. The next few months brought a flurry of activity as the foundation took shape. Legal structures had to be established, educational curricula developed, partnerships forged with museums and historical societies across New England. I found myself in meetings with lawyers and accountants, people who looked at me with the kind of professional respect I'd never experienced when I was pretending to struggle financially. But the most meaningful moments came from unexpected places, like the email I received from Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who'd sold me the Gould document box for $20. She'd seen the museum exhibition and recognized the piece in the catalog. She wrote, "I'm not upset that I sold it for so little. I'm thrilled that it ended up with someone who understood its importance. My grandmother would be so pleased to know that her sewing box, which is what we always called it, is now helping people learn about American craftsmanship. Would it be possible for me to visit the museum and see it on display?" I arranged not just a visit, but a private tour, during which Mrs. Henderson shared family stories that added rich context to the piece's provenance. Her great-grandmother had indeed used it as a sewing box, but it had originally belonged to her great-great-grandfather, a merchant who'd commissioned it from Nathaniel Gould in 1765. The family had preserved it for 5 generations without fully understanding its historical significance.
"You gave it the life it deserved," Mrs. Henderson told me as we stood before the display case. "We kept it safe, but you made it meaningful again." Her words captured something essential about what I'd learned in my transformation from secret collector to public scholar. Preservation without understanding was incomplete. Objects needed not just to survive, but to be comprehended, contextualized, celebrated. My role wasn't just to authenticate pieces, it was to help them tell their stories, to connect them with people who could appreciate their significance. The Foundation's first workshop took place on a crisp October morning, 6 months after its establishment. 15 participants gathered in a renovated warehouse in Cambridge that I'd converted into a teaching space, complete with examination equipment, research libraries, and hands-on learning stations. The group was intentionally diverse: museum interns, local dealers, historical society volunteers, and 3 recipients of need-based scholarships, including the graduate student I'd met at the exhibition. "Authentication is detective work," I told them as we began with a collection of objects that ranged from genuine period pieces to clever reproductions. But instead of solving crimes, we're solving mysteries of craftsmanship, provenance, and historical context. Every piece has a story, and our job is to learn how to read it. Watching them work, examining joinery techniques, analyzing patina, researching maker's marks, I felt a satisfaction deeper than I had experienced during my years of solitary discovery. These people would return to their communities with new skills, new ways of seeing, new appreciation for the material culture that surrounded them. They would save objects I would never see, make discoveries I would never make, and ask questions that would advance the field in directions I couldn't predict. During the lunch break, the graduate student approached me with barely contained excitement. "I think I found something," she said, gesturing toward a wooden chest that I'd included as a practice piece. The secondary wood, the tool marks, the construction technique,
I think this might be Connecticut River Valley work, possibly late 17th century. I followed her to the examination station and looked at the evidence she'd gathered. She was right. Completely. Impressively right. The piece that I'd bought for $50 at a church sale and intended as a learning example was actually a significant early American chest, worth potentially 20 times what I'd paid for it. But more important than its monetary value was what the discovery represented. In 6 hours of structured learning, this young scholar had developed enough observational skill to recognize something I initially missed. She would be better at this work because of what she'd learned, and the field would be richer because of her contributions. "What happens to the chest now that we've identified it correctly?" she asked. It was a fair question, one that touched on the ethical dimensions of authentication work. "What do you think should happen to it?" She considered carefully before answering. "It should go somewhere people can see it and learn from it. Maybe a museum, maybe a historical society, somewhere its story can be told properly." I smiled, recognizing the moment when passion transformed into purpose, when someone moved from wanting to possess historical objects to wanting to preserve them for others. "I think you're absolutely right, and I think you should be the one to write the documentation for its donation." The Foundation's first year exceeded every goal we'd set. We'd trained 43 people in authentication techniques, awarded scholarships to 12 students, and funded preservation projects at 6 local historical societies. More significantly, we'd begun to document previously unknown pieces as our trained volunteers made discoveries in their own communities. The ripple effects extended far beyond our immediate programs. Museums reported increased donations from families who'd learned to recognize the significance of inherited objects. Auction houses noted more accurate descriptions from consigners who'd attended our workshops. Historical societies saw growing interest from volunteers who wanted to help catalog and preserve their collections. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was personal. I'd finally found the balance between professional success and family connection that had eluded me for so long. Sunday dinners at my parents' house had become regular again, with conversations filled not with worry about my future, but with excitement about my latest projects. Dad, fully recovered from his surgery and more energetic than he'd been in years, had become one of the Foundation's most enthusiastic supporters. He'd started attending estate sales with me again, not as a participant, but as an observer who enjoyed watching people's reactions when they learned about the historical significance of objects they'd inherited or collected. "You're teaching people to see beauty in things they might have thrown away," he said during one of these outings. "That's a gift that keeps giving long after you're gone." Sarah had integrated the Foundation work into her marketing firm, developing communication strategies that reached audiences we never could have connected with on our own. Her children, my teenage nephews, had become unofficial junior authenticators, their young eyes often spotting details that adults missed.
"They're growing up understanding that old things have value beyond money," Sarah observed during a family dinner. "That history is something you can touch and hold, not just read about in books." The transformation was complete, but in a way I'd never expected. Instead of choosing between my secret success and my family relationships, I'd found a way to integrate them, to use my expertise in service of something larger than personal achievement. The knowledge I'd guarded so carefully for 5 years had become the foundation, literally, for education, preservation, and community building. Standing in my loft one evening as the sun set over Boston, I looked around at the pieces that had once defined my hidden life. They were still there, still beautiful, still valuable, but they'd been joined by something more precious. Letters from scholarship recipients, photos from successful preservation projects, documentation of discoveries made by people I'd trained. The Persian rug that had fooled Sarah still anchored my living room, but now it shared space with a display case containing examples of different weaving techniques, materials I used in my teaching. The Chippendale Highboy still occupied a place of honor, but its story was now told in a catalog essay that helped thousands of people understand the sophistication of 18th century American furniture making. I was still Mia Chen, the antiques expert, but I was also Mia Chen, the teacher, the foundation director, the sister who could finally be honest about her success. I'd learned that true wealth wasn't measured just in dollars or even in beautiful objects, but in knowledge shared, students taught, and cultural heritage preserved for future generations. The secret I'd protected so carefully had become the gift I was most proud to give away. 3 years later, I stood in the morning light of a different kind of estate sale, one that would have been impossible during my years of secret collecting. The Pemberton family had contacted me directly, not through classified ads or estate sale companies, but because they'd heard about my work through the foundation and wanted to ensure their grandmother's collection found its way to people who would appreciate its significance. "We've been dreading this for months," Mrs. Pemberton told me as we walked through rooms filled with 3 generations of careful collecting. "Grandmother knew so much about these pieces, but she never wrote anything down. We're afraid we'll accidentally donate something important to Goodwill. Or worse, throw away something that belongs in a museum." This had become my new normal. Families who sought me out not because they wanted to maximize profit, but because they wanted to honor the intentions of collectors who'd passed away. The shift represented something profound about how my public emergence had changed not just my work, but the broader conversation around inherited collections. "Your grandmother was clearly a woman of exceptional taste," I said, examining a secretary desk that showed all the signs of being a documented Newport piece. "But more than that, she understood the importance of preservation. Look at how carefully everything has been maintained." The house was a treasure trove, but not in the overwhelming way that had once made my pulse quicken with acquisition fever. Now I saw it as an educational opportunity, a chance to help a family understand their inheritance while ensuring that significant pieces found appropriate homes. Some would go to museums, some to serious collectors, some would remain with family members who developed new appreciation for what they'd inherited. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "CNN wants to interview you about the Foundation's impact on regional preservation efforts. Thursday at 2 p.m. work?" I typed back a quick confirmation, still amazed at how routine media attention had become. The documentary that had aired 6 months ago, Hidden in Plain Sight, America's Secret Art Detectives, had transformed me from a respected but specialized expert into something approaching a household name. The documentary had followed me for a year, filming authentication processes, foundation workshops, and the stories of families who discovered treasures in their own homes. The producer had been particularly interested in the before and after of my life, the journey from secrecy to publicity, from isolation to community building. What's remarkable, the narrator had observed in the final cut, is that Mia Chen's expertise became more valuable, not less, when she decided to share it openly. By teaching others to recognize authentic pieces, she created a network of informed observers who collectively preserve far more American material culture than any individual collector could manage alone. The documentary aired during prime time and drawn over 3 million viewers, leading to inquiries from families across the country who wanted help understanding inherited collections. The Foundation's educational programs had expanded to include online workshops, traveling exhibitions, and partnership programs with historical societies in 12 states. But perhaps more significantly, it had inspired other experts in related fields to emerge from their own forms of professional secrecy. Archaeologists who'd been doing contract work in isolation started sharing their discoveries more broadly. Folk art experts began offering public education programs. The ripple effects had created something approaching a renaissance in public engagement with material culture. "Miss Chen?" A young voice interrupted my examination of the Newport secretary. I looked up to see a girl of maybe 16, notebook in hand, and the kind of focused intensity I recognized in serious students. "I'm Rebecca Pemberton. I'm working on a school project about family history, and I was wondering if you could help me understand what makes these things historically important." I smiled, recognizing in her the same curiosity that had driven me to that first yard sale in Cambridge. "What do you see when you look at this desk?" She approached the piece carefully, running her eyes over the surface with more systematic attention than most adults managed. "The wood is beautiful, and it looks old. But there's something about the proportions that seems, I don't know,
Intentional? Like whoever made it was trying to achieve a specific effect. Exactly right, I said, impressed by her instinctive understanding of design principles. This desk was made around 1760 in Newport, Rhode Island, during a period when American craftsmen were developing their own aesthetic language while working within English traditions. The proportions you're noticing represent hours of thoughtful planning by someone who understood both function and beauty. As I explained the techniques used in 18th century furniture construction, I watched Rebecca's face light up with the kind of understanding that transformed objects from decorative items into historical documents. This was what I'd learned in 3 years of public teaching, that authentic enthusiasm was contagious, that sharing knowledge multiplied rather than diminished it, and that the best discoveries often came from fresh eyes approaching familiar objects. Could you teach me to recognize these things? She asked. I mean, not professionally, but just for understanding family pieces better? There's actually a workshop next month specifically designed for high school students interested in material culture, I told her. The foundation sponsors several scholarships each year for young people who want to learn authentication basics. Her eyes widened with the kind of excitement I remembered from my own educational breakthroughs. Really? That would be amazing. Later, as I worked my way through the Pemberton collection with the systematic attention that had become my trademark, I thought about how completely my definition of success had evolved. 3 years ago, finding a Newport secretary desk would have meant a significant financial windfall, a prize to be quietly acquired and privately celebrated. Today, it meant something entirely different, an opportunity to educate, to preserve, to connect an object with people who could appreciate and care for it properly. The financial rewards had actually increased rather than decreased with my public emergence. Authentication work commanded higher fees now that clients could be certain they were working with a documented expert. The Foundation's workshops consistently sold out at premium prices. Book deals and consulting contracts provided steady income streams that had never existed during my years of anonymous dealing. But money had become almost incidental to the deeper satisfactions of my work. The previous week, I'd received an email from Dr. Jennifer Liu, one of my first scholarship recipients, who was now completing her PhD in American Decorative Arts at Yale. Her dissertation research had uncovered a previously unknown furniture workshop in Colonial, Connecticut, discoveries that built directly on authentication techniques she'd learned in my foundation programs. I trace my entire career to that first workshop you taught. Not just the technical skills, but the way of seeing that recognizes story and significance in objects other people might overlook. I'm hoping to establish similar educational programs on the West Coast, carrying forward the mission you started.
Now, 5 years later, I moved through that world like a ghost, invisible to the very people who could have elevated me to celebrity status in their circles. I knew collectors who would kill for access to my finds, auction houses that would beg for my consignments, museums that would court my expertise. But anonymity was my armor, protecting not just my sources, but my family from a truth they weren't equipped to handle. The phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, my contact at the auction house. Client interested in the Chippendale. Can you authenticate provenance by Friday? I typed back a quick confirmation, then walked to my bedroom closet where the piece in question sat behind my winter coats like any other piece of secondhand furniture. A highboy that I'd bought for $35 from a widow in Marblehead, not knowing until I got it home that the construction techniques and wood aging pointed to 1760s Philadelphia, to one of the most celebrated furniture makers in American history. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. I lived surrounded by millions of dollars in authenticated antiques, yet I drove a 15-year-old Honda and shopped at thrift stores for my own clothes. The money I made, and it was substantial, far more than Sarah could imagine, went mostly back into the hunt. Better equipment, travel expenses, building relationships with estate sale companies and auction houses across 3 states. Some went into a savings account that grew steadily but invisibly, a safety net I hoped never to need. But the larger truth, the one that I carried like a secret weight in my chest, was that the money had never really been the point. It was the thrill of the hunt, the intellectual puzzle of authentication, the pure joy of rescuing beauty from obscurity. Every piece I'd saved from the Goodwill pile or the estate sale discard box felt like a small victory against the forces that would see history relegated to landfills and art dismissed as decoration. I thought about Sarah's words as I prepared for the day ahead. 3 estate sales in Newton, a house call in Beacon Hill to examine what the owner thought might be a fake Monet, but which, from the photo she had sent, bore all the hallmarks of being genuine. Each location held the possibility of discovery, the chance that someone's unwanted inheritance might be my next great find. But first I had to play the part. I changed into clothes carefully chosen to look casual, unassuming, broke. Jeans with authentic wear rather than designer distressing, a sweater from Target that I'd actually bought at Target, not from some vintage boutique in the South End. Worn sneakers that had earned their scuffs through honest miles rather than artificial aging. The costume of the harmless amateur, the wannabe, who posed no threat to the serious collectors. As I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, my phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. Ms. Chen, heard about your Revere Silver authentication. Very interested in discussing a potential acquisition. Can we meet? I deleted it without responding. There were always people trying to track me down, collectors who'd gotten wind of my reputation through the underground network of dealers and auction houses. But the moment I stepped into the light, became someone they could put a name and face to, everything would change. The access would dry up, the prices would skyrocket, and the pure joy of discovery would be corrupted by expectation and commercial pressure. Better to remain a ghost story whispered among the initiated. Better to let Sarah think I was failing while I quietly assembled one of the most significant private collections of American decorative arts on the East Coast. Better to endure the worried looks and well-meaning interventions than to explain why I'd chosen this strange, secret life over the conventional success they could understand. The elevator descended toward the parking garage, carrying me toward another day of carefully orchestrated deception. In a few hours, I'd be the slightly disparaging-looking woman pawing through someone's grandmother's things, offering $20 for what I hoped might be worth $20,000. I'd nod politely when other shoppers pointed out the junk I was buying, smile vaguely when dealers dismissed my purchases as tourist trinkets. And tonight, I'd return to my loft full of treasures, surrounded by beauty that most people would walk past without a second glance, carrying the weight of a secret that grew heavier and more valuable with each passing day. The secret was that I wasn't failing at all. I was succeeding beyond anyone's wildest imagination in a language they'd never learned to speak. The Newton estate sale was everything I'd hoped for and everything I'd feared. The house itself was a testament to old New England money, Georgian colonial with original wide plank floors and crown molding that had witnessed 3 centuries of family dinners and holiday gatherings. But the family was gone now, scattered to retirement communities and distant cities, leaving behind a lifetime's accumulation of what they considered worthless relics.
The Persian rug that had started so many conversations with Sarah now anchored a living room that regularly hosted foundation board meetings, scholarship interviews, and informal gatherings of people passionate about preserving material culture. The Chippendale Highboy had become a teaching tool, featured in authentication workshops and documentary films that helped people understand the sophistication of colonial American craftsmanship. But the most meaningful additions were less tangible. Letters from students who'd found careers in museum work because of foundation programs, photographs from successful preservation projects, documentation of discoveries made by people I'd trained. These represented the multiplication of impact that had become my new definition of success. My phone rang as I navigated downtown traffic, Sarah's name appearing on the dashboard display. I accepted the call, knowing she was probably working late on foundation business, despite my repeated suggestions that she maintain better work-life balance. "Good timing," she said without preamble. "I just got off a call with the producer who's working on the follow-up documentary. They want to focus on the foundation's impact, especially the ripple effects from people you've trained."
What kind of ripple effects? Remember Jennifer Liu, your scholarship recipient who's finishing her PhD at Yale? Her research on Connecticut colonial furniture has led to the identification of 12 previously unknown pieces, including one that's being acquired by the Winter Thayer Museum. And Michael Torres, the Historical Society volunteer from Springfield, he's used techniques from your workshop to authenticate 3 significant pieces in their collection, including a desk that they now believe was made by a documented craftsman. The news filled me with a satisfaction deeper than any I'd experienced during my solitary collecting years. These weren't just success stories. They were evidence of knowledge systems working as intended, expertise spreading and multiplying rather than stagnating in isolation. There's more, Sarah continued. The producer wants to film at next month's Foundation Gala. She's particularly interested in the scholarship presentations and the new partnership announcements. The gala had become an annual celebration of preservation victories and educational achievements, bringing together foundation supporters, scholarship recipients, and partner organizations for an evening that combined fundraising with genuine community building. This year's event would announce expansion into 3 new states, the establishment of endowed scholarships at 2 universities, and the launch of an online certification program for volunteer authenticators. But beyond the formal announcements, the gala represented something more personal, the celebration of relationships that had grown from my decision to emerge from anonymity. Museum curators who'd become collaborators and friends, collectors who'd shifted from competitors to colleagues, families who'd discovered new appreciation for their inherited treasures. I'm proud of what we've built, I told Sarah as I pulled into my parking garage. Not just the foundation, but the whole ecosystem of people who care about preserving material culture. You should be proud. But Mia, remember that it all started with you being brave enough to step into the light. Everything else grew from that decision. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a few minutes processing the weight of her observation. The transformation of my life hadn't begun with any grand plan or strategic vision. It had started with a simple decision to trust my family with the truth about my success, to prioritize honesty over competitive advantage, to value relationships over isolation. That single choice had unlocked possibilities I'd never imagined, not just professional opportunities, but deeper satisfactions that came from contributing to something larger than personal achievement. The expertise I thought would be diminished by sharing had actually been enhanced by collaboration, multiplied by teaching, and strengthened by community engagement. Upstairs in my loft, I found the latest batch of scholarship applications waiting for review. 15 aspiring material culture specialists from across the country, each with their own story about discovering passion for historical objects, each needing financial support to develop their expertise professionally. Reading through their essays, I saw echoes of my own journey. The excitement of recognition, the hunger for knowledge, the desire to preserve and protect cultural heritage.
One application particularly caught my attention. Maria Santos, a community college student from New Mexico, had written about discovering colonial silver in her grandmother's house, pieces that had been in the family for generations without anyone understanding their significance. Her essay described the thrill of research, the satisfaction of authentication, the responsibility she felt to ensure these objects were properly preserved and documented. I want to learn not just for myself, she'd written, but so I can help other families in my community understand what they might own, help historical organizations preserve their collections properly, help ensure that pieces of our material heritage don't get lost or thrown away because nobody recognizes their importance. Her words perfectly captured the mission that had emerged from my own journey: the democratization of expertise, the multiplication of preservation capacity, the building of networks that could protect cultural heritage more effectively than any individual collector could manage alone. I made a note to recommend her for a full scholarship, knowing that her passion and community focus would make her an excellent ambassador for the Foundation's values. As I prepared for bed, I walked through my loft one final time, observing spaces that had been transformed multiple times over the past 8 years,
From law school graduate's apartment to secret collector's lair to public expert's home office to foundation headquarters, each iteration had reflected different priorities, different understandings of what mattered most. Now, the space felt balanced, purposeful, aligned with values that had clarified through years of experimentation and growth. Beautiful objects remained, but they served educational purposes rather than just personal satisfaction. Comfortable furnishings supported both solitary work and collaborative meetings. Technology enabled both scholarship and teaching, both documentation and communication. Most importantly, the loft felt connected rather than isolated, linked through digital networks and personal relationships to a community of people who shared my passion for preserving and understanding material culture. The secrets that had once filled these rooms had been replaced by something more valuable, the satisfaction of meaningful work that served purposes larger than individual success. My last task of the evening was responding to emails from foundation supporters, scholarship recipients, and families who'd reached out for advice about inherited collections. Each message represented someone who'd been touched by our work, whose life had been enriched by understanding and preserving cultural heritage. Dr. Morrison had written to share news about the traveling exhibition, which was now in its third year and had been viewed by over 500,000 people across 7 states. Your decision to go public has had impact far beyond what any of us imagined, she had observed. You've helped create a new model for how expertise can serve public education while advancing scholarly knowledge. Rebecca Pemberton, the teenager I'd met that morning, had sent a follow-up email with photographs of family pieces she'd been researching, asking thoughtful questions about construction techniques and historical context. Her enthusiasm reminded me of my own younger self, but her approach was more systematic, more grounded in methodology than my early intuitive explorations had been. I've been thinking about what you said about stewardship versus ownership. It makes me see our family collection completely differently, not as things that belong to us, but as things we're responsible for protecting and understanding for future generations. Her words perfectly captured the evolution in thinking that had become central to the Foundation's mission. Ownership was temporary, stewardship was eternal. Individual collectors could preserve objects for decades, but cultural institutions and educated communities could preserve them for centuries. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 8 years ago, I'd been a failed law student buying a $2 book at a Cambridge yard sale, unknowingly taking the first step toward a career I couldn't have imagined. 5 years ago, I'd been a secretive collector, hiding my success from the people I loved most. 3 years ago, I'd been a newly public expert, terrified that transparency would destroy everything I'd built. Now, I was something else entirely. Not just an expert or collector or teacher, but a catalyst for cultural preservation. Someone whose work had created systems and relationships that would continue long after my own involvement ended. The expertise I thought would be diminished by sharing had become more powerful through collaboration, more meaningful through education, more lasting through institutional support.
The money that had once been my primary measure of success now felt almost incidental to the deeper satisfactions of my work. I was wealthy beyond anything my family had imagined possible, but the wealth felt most valuable when it supported scholarships for students who couldn't otherwise afford training, funded preservation projects at small historical societies, enabled educational programs that reached communities throughout New England. This was what I learned in the transformation from secret collector to public educator. That true success wasn't measured in objects acquired or profits earned, but in knowledge shared, students taught, and cultural heritage preserved for future generations. The treasures I'd discovered in dusty attics and cluttered estate sales had become less important than the treasure I'd found in human connection, in the satisfaction of work that served something larger than personal achievement. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new students to teach, and objects to authenticate, and stories to preserve. But tonight, I felt the deep contentment that came from understanding my place in the larger continuum of cultural preservation.
from knowing that my work would continue through the people I'd trained and the systems I'd built, long after I was no longer there to guide them. The secret I'd guarded so carefully had become the gift I was most proud to give away. And in giving it away, I'd discovered that it had grown beyond anything I could have achieved alone. This was legacy, not the accumulation of valuable objects, but the creation of knowledge systems that would preserve and expand cultural understanding across generations. In the darkness of my loft, surrounded by centuries of American craftsmanship and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work, I finally understood what my father had meant all those years ago when he talked about the importance of finding your calling. I hadn't just found mine, I'd built it, shared it, and watched it grow beyond my wildest imaginings. The treasures would continue to be discovered, authenticated, and preserved. The students would continue to learn, grow, and teach others. The cultural heritage that connected us to our past would continue to be protected and understood, not by any single expert working in isolation, but by a community of people who'd learned to see value in things that might otherwise be overlooked. And sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet and the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, I would remember that it had all started with a simple decision to tell the truth about who I'd become. Everything else had grown from that single act of courage. The choice to trust that honesty would be stronger than secrecy, that sharing knowledge would be more powerful than hoarding it, that stepping into the light would illuminate possibilities that could never exist in the shadows. The journey from secret to scholar was complete, but the work of preservation, education, and cultural stewardship would continue for as long as there were objects to discover, stories to tell, and people passionate enough to ensure that the material heritage of America's past would be protected for America's future.